Today, with Gönül and with two of my colleagues, we'll talk about this recent elections in Turkey 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago almost. And as you know, like in March 31st, Turkey had this municipal elections and which had some dramatic results. For many observers, it was quite surprising. For many, it was pleasantly surprising. So the ruling party of President Erdogan, who was the first prime minister and the president for 20 something years, first time historically defeated and became the second party in Turkey. This is a pretty dramatic event, and the Republican Social Democratic Republican Party (CHP) since first time since 1989 in the municipal elections, and in fact since 1978 we can say, became the first party in a election. And 2019, CHP actually was able to win the elections in municipal elections, and they got Istanbul to three major cities: Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. In this election, they kept these cities with this kind of, if you like, star mayors. Especially two of them, Ekrem İmamoğlu of Istanbul and Mansur Yavaş of Ankara. But now the margin between the Development and Justice Party and Republican Party got much larger. This was very dramatic. In Ankara, for instance, the mayor, Republican mayor, got 60%, and the Justice Development Party candidate got 30%. This was pretty dramatic event. So today, almost 65% of Turkish population is going to be under Social Democratic Republican Party's municipal rule, and 85% of all Turkish economy is going to be actually in that in the regions where this party is going to be the if you like, the local government. But it was surprising because just a year ago, actually, Erdogan won the elections with a narrow margin. But there was this expectations that the allied opposition was going to win. Many of the observers thought that 1 year ago, the Erdogan regime might end, and it didn't happen. So within this year, what happened this year, so that we had this result? How should we evaluate it? How should we understand that? In fact, the opposition alliance, it collapsed. So just after the general election, so it was even much more difficult for the Republican Party to win, people thought. But the result was the opposite. So how can we explain that? How we just interpret this result? Does this signify a kind of a democratic revival and a possible erosion of authoritarianism in Turkey? Can we read like that? How the Erdogan regime will respond to this in the coming months and years? The general elections are supposed to be in 2028, so they're like 4 years if there's not obviously early elections. So what's going to happen in these 4 years? How the dynamic between general governance and municipal governance will take place? What is how the Kurdish political movement react to that? There is also a kind of a crisis in Kurdish political movement. whether there's some voices in the Kurdish party actually advocated a kind of a dialogue between the regime with the regime before the elections. What's going to happen to the Kurdish politics, and how the foreign policy and the American elections and the Israeli-Hamas war will affect this next couple of months, next period, next year or a couple of years. So we have lots of interesting questions, and so we have, as I said, three speakers. Gönül Tol is our guest for this week. As I said yesterday, we had a great event. She talked about her first book, her recent book, on Erdogan's war, a strong man's struggle at home and in Syria. And now we drag her to give her insight about Turkish municipal elections. Gönül is the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program in Washington, D.C., and she's a senior fellow with the Black Sea program.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Ali. You actually raised really important points in your initial remarks. Thank you to all of you for coming here. I'm honored to be here. So, Ali asked what happened last year, and that's a legitimate question because Ali and I co-authored a piece which became very controversial last year. We wrote it for Foreign Policy, and we argued that this was before May elections. We argued that Erdogan could be beaten at the ballot box and could lose the presidential elections. And at the time, the piece was read widely and circulated widely. And our reasoning was this: it was a very difficult 2023 was a year from hell for Erdogan. The country was struck by a devastating earthquake, and the government's slow response caused a lot of backlash. So that was number one. And the elections were held shortly after the earthquake. And the second and maybe even more troubling development for Erdogan last year was the country was struggling with serious economic problems, double-digit inflation, and the growing frustration, particularly among the country's urban middle class. And we put two and two together, and we said Erdogan's support is waning considerably, and we listed several factors that really led to that conclusion. And then May elections happened, and Erdogan captured presidency. And we had to endure a lot of criticism on Facebook, and people, both on Twitter, I said on Twitter, and also I should say in major U.S. magazines like Foreign Policy, people from both pro Erdogan and anti-Erdogan camps criticized our assessment on several points. And the first one was, they said, you don't know what you're talking about. The anti-Erdogan camp said, Erdogan is never going to lose elections because Turkey has become a consolidated autocracy, and elections in Erdogan's new Turkey, they don't matter. So that was the first criticism directed at us by the anti-Erdogan camp. And the pro-Erdogan camp said, you don't know what you're talking about because Erdogan supporters, there's this special chemistry that you guys don't understand between Erdogan and his supporters, and those supporters are gonna stand by him through thick and thin. It doesn't matter how economic crisis has hit the country, they're gonna vote for him. And that came from the pro-Erdogan camp. And there were others who said, well, you're right. I mean, this is a very difficult year. And in fact, the domestic context is quite ripe for an opposition victory. And yet, the opposition has the wrong candidate. So those were the three criticisms that were directed at us. And we both did not dismiss the third one. We both thought that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, that was fielded by the opposition as its candidate, we both thought that he was an uninspiring figure, and the fact that the six-party coalition, opposition coalition, was struck by this internal fighting, and it really projected an image of weakness to the electorate at a time when the voters really wanted a unified stance to tackle on the country's problems. So in fact, we expected this victory in March captured by the opposition last year, and it didn't happen. So what happened? Before that, I want to say something, which is we have to be cautious because these were local elections. So reaching conclusions about the national political dynamics, you might say, is not that easy and straightforward, and I agree with that. But on the other hand, this is what I say, we can still say a few things about the national political dynamics looking at what happened in municipal elections, and here is why. Because Erdogan, people were supposed to go to the ballot box and elect their local administrators and mayors. So this was all about local politics, but Erdogan turned the vote into a referendum on his rule. He campaigned very hard. He personally attacked the opposition's most popular candidates. He even threatened the electorate that if they did not vote for his candidate, they would not receive any services from the central government. So he weighed in on this very heavily, which turned the vote into a referendum on his rule. So that means the victory secured by the main opposition party in March elections is not just a loss for the ruling party, but also signals Erdogan's waning support. And that is very important. So what happened? Well, simply the reality of the country caught up with the voters. So I believe this was voters' delayed reaction to the country's dynamics. I was listening to a podcast recently on American politics, and scholars were saying that American economy has never been stronger. It's been the strongest in the last 50 years. But if you look at the polls, people don't really agree with that, right? There's not enough support for Biden to indicate that people actually feel that American economy is strong. So I think some Stanford scholars made the argument that in fact, their studies indicate that it takes 2 years, more than a year, for the electorate to catch up with economic reality. So that's actually what's happened in Turkey too. Turkish economy is struggling for some time. But last year, right before the elections, when we wrote the piece, what we didn't consider was the fact that the economic crisis was mainly hitting urban middle class, which was not voting for Erdogan anyway. The repercussions, economic repercussions, were not really felt by Erdogan's own constituency at the time. And since then, things have gotten worse on the economic front. And now, Erdogan's own constituency feel that something is going terribly wrong with the country's economic direction. And the second thing that caught up to the voters is the reality that emerged out of the earthquake. So if you look at the earthquake hit regions, many people voted for Erdogan in the earthquake zone. And to me, that was, as someone who lost family members in the earthquake, both heartbreaking and as a political scientist, somewhat surprising. So how can people see this Erdogan's slow response to the earthquake and be so frustrated with it and yet still vote for him? What I failed to recognize was the psychological impact of these huge crises on the electorate. So people in the earthquake zones, many of them felt like they really needed a strong leader. It was a time of great chaos. And when these things hit people, it has a rally around the leader of impact on the voters. And that's exactly what happened. Many people thought that only Erdogan could rebuild the cities. He had pledged that and they believed him, so they voted for him. But 12 months on, many of them are still living in shelters. So there is that frustration as well. And the third factor, as to your question to what happened, is the issue of the candidacy. So what this election tells us is that who the candidate does matter. So last year, the opposition's candidate was a 70-something-year-old man who was not quite inspiring, but I think more importantly, I think the election, the coalition the opposition forged, which comprised of 6 ideologically different parties, it really did not project strength, right? It seemed chaotic, and people thought, you know, we are struggling with so many problems, and these guys are fighting among themselves. Are they gonna fix my problems? So they couldn't really put their faith into that coalition. But right now things changed. There's a new leader leading the main opposition party, and then there's charismatic leaders like Istanbul Mayor İmamoğlu who are leading the fight. So that means that people now have more faith, and they think that these candidates can actually get things done. So I think, and I'll stop there, those 3 things made the difference this year.
Thank you, Gönül. So upon that comment, let me turn to Halil and Ayca. Okay, first Ayca.
Okay.
Like,
All right.
and then you will comment, and then maybe raise some other questions.
Yeah.
You also like handouts?
Oh yeah, I just want for people who sort of didn't follow the elections closely, I just brought a map just for you to, you know, see the difference from before the elections. There are 2 maps there, one from the 2019 local elections, the other one is from the recent 2024 elections. And I'm sorry, the printing is not that great, but you will see the expansion of red, which is the main opposition party, Republican People's Party. And at the bottom, you're seeing 3 mayors of Izmir, Ankara, and Istanbul, and the votes that they you know, got in this last election. As you will see, it's like really high. It's over 50% in Istanbul, about 50% in Izmir, and over 60% in Ankara. But in addition to these, the Republican People's Party got 10 more cities, which some of them which they have never had the local governments in the Republican history, so it's pretty significant. And in the big cities like Istanbul and Ankara, they won many more districts in comparison to 2019. So this is just for you to see what we're talking about when we talk about election success for the main opposition. So Gönül mentioned the economy, and I agree, the economy was really, really significant. One of the things that people ask, but the economy was really bad, like in the last elections. What was different now? Why did the economy didn't sort of, you know, urge voters to vote against Erdogan that time, but this time? I think the economy is much worse in many ways. I'll just give you one example. I think in the 2023 general elections, the exchange rate between Turkish lira and dollar was about 122, around there. Now it's $1 is 34 Turkish lira. So this is just one indicator for you to understand how things are. And when you go to Turkey, people are really feeling, and they are impoverished. Like every level of the society is feeling that. Like middle classes, working classes. It's very, very palpable on the streets. You know, people talk about economy all the time. So I agree, the earthquake, the impact of earthquake sort of hits people later on. I mean, it hits on that day, but then the political impact of it sort of came out later. I totally agree with that, and I agree with the candidacy issue. But I want to also talk about maybe 2 or 3 factors. One is I think, rationalization of the opposition parties' strategies. The politics was really, really important. The way they field candidates in places. I mean, one will think, you know, they have been losing elections in the last 20 years, right? Why didn't they sort of come up with better strategies for determining candidates, for election campaigns and all that? I mean, I think they slowly, during the Kılıçdaroğlu chairmanship, they slowly moved the party and opened it to different groups. But I think that rationalization in the party organization didn't happen. And I think in this election, they did a good job in determining who will win in each district. They did a good, I think, field work. And I think hopefully this will continue. The other thing is I think, again, changing of the party organization a little bit, like this new leadership. There's a good, like, you know, group of leaders, younger leaders, that are sort of carrying the party. And I think in 2023, people didn't see like an alternative in Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. They just, you know, didn't think he was an good alternative to Erdogan. But I think with this new group of leaders, we're seeing like, you know, actually these people can rule the country. And part of that perception, which is my kind of third, I think, reason why CHP, the Republican People's Party, had a surprise to us maybe win, is because these in the municipalities that they won in Izmir, I mean not so much Izmir, but Ankara and Istanbul, these mayors did a really good job, given that their resources are being controlled through the central government. They weren't able to do the projects that they want to, like even to bring finances to these local, you know, big cities like Istanbul, they have to go through the central government. Even if they're applying to, you know, like European funds and things like that, it has to be central government. And they were really constrained by Erdogan's government. So despite that, I think they did some very, very significant things, like just changing people's everyday lives, like you know, the free sort of bus sort of rides services to mothers, to women, right? That was one of the. I mean, they did some, you know, research about what do people want, like women who are sitting at home. Yeah, what do they want? And they found that, like, not having money to travel is a big issue in Istanbul for many women. So they did, you know, they executed these policies that support like women's physical mobility within a city. That was really good. But they also like opened daycares. There were infrastructure projects like metro projects. So they really like show that they can govern, and they can govern well, right? So I think that was also a big impact in this win. Maybe I'll just stop here, and then we can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Halil, please.
Yes, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for coming here. So just 9 months ago, as Gönül explained in very great detail, Turkey had the general elections, and Erdogan's party, with the six-party coalition, came first. And the opposition was extremely demoralized at that time, even to the extent that, like, we thought maybe this time the groups that resist autocratization, now they would give up and the regime would consolidate itself. Actually, Ayca and I had this exact talk after a lunch. Like, we always used to think these are going to go, they won't stay. But after that, are they consolidating autocracy now? Is this now like the new Turkey, like Iran, that we will just mourn? But then, actually, also like during those elections in May, I was at Gönül's home, and we were commiserating. Like we were extremely demoralized. Then, like after these elections, actually there was a joke on Twitter, which I liked very much. Like a colleague said, like Turkey is like an ex who would text you at midnight right when you decided to move on.
This new election.
Yeah.
Yeah, after that, yeah.
So something has changed, and what has changed, we have been discussing that. I want to unpack some of the arguments that Gönül has laid out, and also Ayca has discussed. So, there is a big unknown in these elections, which is what would happen if these were general elections at this time. We don't know that. As Gönül mentioned, these are local elections, and because they are local elections, they may not stand for anything bigger than themselves. That could be one option. The other option is, as we have been saying, the voters they are lagging behind. They just caught up with this economy. So after last elections, there were a number of explanations. People started speculating why Erdogan won after all. In terms of economy, there is actually another sort of reasoning. One is, it could be lagging behind. Another one could be, you would say, actually Turkey's economy has been very bad, even more than 2 years. So it should have caught up by that time. But they say Erdogan actually implemented a lot of policies, economic policies, that cushioned his base against the economic downturn and the negative effects of the economy. So those economically disadvantaged constituencies, they did not feel that much, and so this is what also, we pointed out, as they hit the middle class first, and then later they hit lower class. But people also said, apart from the earthquake and rallying around the leader effect, people also said, even though these people are extremely disadvantaged economically, they still saw in Erdogan something bigger than themselves, this strong, big leader who's gonna make Turkey great again. And the biggest signifier of that is, of course, the military industry. People are now, getting hyped up with the Turkish drones, armed drones, that they sell to Ukraine and all. So maybe, I want to raise that issue, and maybe we should discuss that. But there's also something else. Erdogan in these elections was not just pulled from the direction of CHP, but also from within its own ranks, the Refah or Refahigen Party, Yeniden Refah Party, which was founded by the son of late Erbakan, the longtime leader of the National Outlook movement, the Turkish political Islam, and a lot of people who were disenchanted, the speculation goes, disenchanted with Erdogan's policies, they either stayed home or some of them voted for Refah New Party. We don't know. We don't have actually poll surveys in Turkey, so we don't exactly know that, but we can only speculate some about that. So is that a factor? Should we really consider that? And also the war going on in Gaza. Some people speculated, since the opposition was able to show the links, the close trade links between Erdogan's family and Erdogan's cronies with Israel, so they were able to corner Erdogan on that account, and they were able to show Erdogan's travesty in terms of his hidden support for Israel. Would that have played an effect on the constituency? That's another question that we may need to consider. But I have like bigger questions for Gönül. So, can competitive elections, after all, can competitive authoritarian regimes, after all, be toppled through elections, after all?
Yeah.
Have those who argued that competing in these unfair elections would give the facade of democracy in Turkey the legitimacy that it needed in the international scene, and would it have been like some of those would have said, yeah, it is maybe better to boycott the elections rather than, give them legitimacy. But these elections gave many of the democratic circles new hope that maybe, we can show to the world that competitive authoritarian regimes could be toppled by electoral means, and this could be just a signal of that. And like once Erdogan's base gets used to voting for CHP, and that is a very big leap actually for the conservative masses. That's a huge leap to vote for CHP. And once we make that leap of faith, then would it get stuck, and would they continue? Would they stick with CHP unless they botch, like the municipalities? Unless and if they can show, they can prove themselves successful in running these local governments. Thank you.
Let me add something, and then you and then I will have the Q&A with the audience. Just after election, we have interesting reactions. One person who is a kind of a main legal advisor of Erdogan said, it's not important what people said. It's important what the state would decide. And this guy is just a bureaucrat.
Yeah.
And then the head of the Nationalist Party, who is a part of this Erdogan coalition, said Turkey was not founded with an election. So elections are not really important. These are really striking remarks coming from the regime. But Erdogan, it's not clear where Erdogan, which direction he will go, right? I mean, he said, well, we lost. We have to accept that. And we have to make some autocritique. And then yesterday, he said, in fact, we won this election. Because then he added his party's vote and then the Nationalist Party's vote together, and so it's not clear where. The third of all, the military industrial complex, basically controlled by Erdogan's family, Turkey. The drones were produced by this company, which is Erdogan's son-in-law. And there's a kind of interesting conflict between not his son-in-law, but brother of his son-in-law, and Ekrem İmamoğlu. This was a very interesting polemic, like on the Kurdish issue.
Yeah.
And for me, the critical group is the Kurds in this. I mean, if you really take Kurds out of the whole equilibrium, the possibilities of Turkish democracy will collapse.
Yeah.
Within the Kurdish establishment, there's also kind of a, if not crisis, a kind of internal reconsideration, different groups, searching, yeah. So overall, yeah, I mean, I will also put those on the table, and
all great questions, and I'm going to start with the military industry, the advances in Turkey's indigenous defense sector. So that actually, Turkey has been making great advances in that, but the thing is that it's only empowering Erdogan and his family. And that became a big source of revenue for Erdogan after Erdogan lost big municipalities like Istanbul in 2019 municipal elections, because those cities, one of the reasons why it really hit him hard when his party lost Istanbul, it's not just because of emotional reasons. I mean, obviously Istanbul is close to his heart. That's where he had launched his political career. That's understandable, but there was a bigger consideration there, and that was Istanbul is the financial capital of the country, and the country produces, generates huge revenue, which Erdogan, since he came to power in 2002, has used to build this large clientelistic network. So Istanbul was the place that was feeding that clientelistic network, and that actually kept Erdogan in power. And that's why he famously said, if we lose Istanbul, we will lose Turkey. So after 2019, once he did not have access to that revenue source, he used the military defense sector to enrich his family, and he tried to recreate that clientelistic network. So it's only a handful of people who receive those contracts in the defense sector. That means that the people at the bottom of the food chain, they don't really feel anything positive. And the second question that you raise is, has Israel been a factor? Erdogan stands on post what happened on October 7th. Did it play a role in Erdogan's loss? I think we don't know, we don't have data, but Erdogan certainly thinks it did play a role. In the meeting that he held with his party members shortly after the election loss, one of the top reasons he cited as that factored into his election loss was Turkey's stance on Israel, right? He used this very anti-Israeli narrative, and yet journalists uncovered that Turkey was still doing business with Israel, even selling weapons parts to Israel. And Erdogan thought that that did play an important role in the rise of this Islamist party. Many disgruntled, conservative, very pro-Palestinian AKP voters voted for an alternative Islamist party because they thought that Erdogan was not being honest about it. And the third, which is very important, Ali, you said, we talked about, and Halil, you asked about, can competitive authoritarian regimes, can you bring down autocrats via elections? And that goes to the heart of this issue of democratic revival. And I really think that there's something very interesting happening here. An Israeli colleague and I recently co-authored a piece which will come out next week, hopefully, where we are saying that in a world where democratic recession, this year is an incredible year, 2024, almost half the country, the world's population is going to the polls at a time when we talk more about democratic recession, right? So this is a critical year, and people are talking about how autocracy and autocrats are on the rise, but you are seeing these pockets of democratic revival in big cities, right? Istanbul, if you look at the map in Turkey, all those big cities are captured by pro-democracy forces. Israel recently held local elections in February. In Israel too, Tel Aviv is the second largest city in the country, and Tel Aviv mayor has taken very important steps against Netanyahu's efforts to consolidate power. He played such an important role in the pro-democracy protests. He led those protests, and he was joined by other pro-democracy mayors in the country. So they initiated this wall of resistance. They're fighting for the soul of Israeli democracy. Other places too, in Poland, in Budapest. So you see the rise of these democratic actors that can really turn the tide. So the question is, what can the mayors do? I remember, I can't quite remember the title, but I remember this wonderful book about how mayors can be the best hope, democracy's best bet. I think it was called If Mayors Rule the World, right? So can these local governments revive democracy? And my answer to that question is yes. And you know how they can? Doing three things. First, they can restore faith in democracy. How? Local governments are closest to the people, right? Especially in autocratic countries where autocrats, they live in these huge palaces and they're out of touch with people's needs. And we've seen that with the recent Rolex watch, people around Erdogan showing off their Rolex watches when people are starving on the street. So they're out of touch. Autocrats are out of touch with the people. And yet you have these mayors who are more in tune with what the people need in their daily lives. And as Ayca mentioned, these mayors in Istanbul, Ankara, elsewhere in Mersin, they have built a very good track record in terms of addressing those needs. And not just that, so they can do something to tackle poverty, right? And that's one of the reasons why people are losing faith in democracy, that it's not delivering. So these mayors can show democracy works. That's number one. And second, I think these mayors can also strengthen the muscle of democracy by, especially in autocratic or autocratizing states, by opening up the decision making to locals, right? They can say, you know, and give them a taste of what it feels to be able to have a say over things that matter to them. And third, I think what they must do and what people like İmamoğlu must do, that they have to have a united global front, mayors for democracy against autocrats. So that could really make a difference. So that's why I'm hopeful. These were only local elections, but don't think that they are just local elections. I think the next task for Turkey's mayors and other mayors across the world is to make sure that they can repeat these victories at the national level and take up the fight against autocracy from bottom up.
Just reference to Marx, you know, all the mayors of the world
Unite, that's right.
Yeah. Can I say something?
Sure, yeah, then we'll...
Okay. I think this is very, very hopeful. But I want to ask something, and also maybe in reference to what we were talking about yesterday, in terms of foreign policy. And the question is, what can go wrong, right? I mean, I think things are very hopeful, not in terms of like this last election, but also when you look at the AKP in the last 4 elections, from 2018 to 2023 general elections, we see about like 6-7% decrease in the votes. When you look at the local elections from 2019 to 24, we see minus, 9% decrease in AKP's votes. So it's like, I think the trend is showing us that the party is basically losing power, every like 3%, 4% every election. So I think this is also hopeful. But then, as we know from Erdogan's practices over the years, there's always something. Like we were expecting that he will kind of lose 2023 elections, but then he came up with this techno-nationalism, Erdogan the Top Gun, in Top Gun outfit. And then in addition to that, there were a lot of election handouts, right? Just before the election, he had this benefits to, like early retirement benefits to millions of people. He raised the minimum wage. He gave lots of salary increases to government officials. So he had basically handouts. So one side was a very cultural, sort of speaking to people's like desire to be powerful in the world, like this techno-nationalist country, Turkey, with all this like industry, military industry. And then the other is like giving these handouts. The last economy didn't, the economy in the last elections didn't allow that because Turkey is basically going bankrupt. But the question for me is like, what can go wrong, right? Yeah. Given that now we have 2 wars in where Turkey is, right?
North
and we
South.
know also like from yesterday's discussion how foreign policy is important for regime survival in Turkey. So
What can go
Yeah.
wrong?
I'll piggyback on that.
Yeah, we.
Yeah, no, I'll just shortly piggyback on that. Like
Shortly.
this scenario. Yeah, I'm not going to make any comment. This scenario, Trump wins here, then the bromance is revived between them, and he gives the go-ahead in Syria, and then like once and for all like eradicating YPG from Syria. Like in that scenario, what would happen?
What
Like,
would happen?
could that happen, and what would happen if that happens?
Okay, just to your point about this global mayors kind of Ekrem İmamoğlu's last, he met the foreign press 2 days ago, and the last part of his speech is very interesting, like echoing your in the new era, Istanbul and Turkey will make a very important contribution to this global struggle with their creative and effective projects. In the new era, Istanbul and Turkey will support democratic awakening, international solidarity, and efforts for global peace. Interesting. Just
Great.
okay. Please.
Wait, there was a question.
Yeah, but we'll
Yeah, let's grab,
see,
take more questions.
yeah, open a discussion. Burçak.
Thank you for the panel. These are wonderful, comments, and it really helps me to think through the not only the last local election but also the national election. I want to ask a methodological question, which will perhaps help us insert our scholarly as well as informed public, members of the informed public, to think about differently than what we are hearing on the airwaves, both in Turkey or abroad, about this election and what sort of hopes it shall or shall not pose for us. So it seems like all of you, even though you are thinking about the incident for the election, from a very nuanced perspective, and you are not really ignoring the difference between the local and the national elections and the electorate's choice in those elections. It seems to me that we are only discussing Erdogan versus the rest, and the rest is now becoming more like the Republican People's Party. I understand the practical reasons for it, but from a methodological point of view, if we look at it as political parties trying to win patronage networks, control over resources at the municipal level, and trying to attempt to make a claim at the national politics through the municipal politics, what can we then see compared to what you are seeing there? So for instance, if we don't ask the question as, oh, did AKP lose this many municipalities, can we ask, who participated in these elections? What's the participation rate? What happened in the earthquake-stricken countries or municipalities so that we saw Erdogan win? How about voter suppression? Why is Kars is now the national movement parties? Municipality as opposed to DEM parties, municipality. So if we then, so the main question is methodologically, let's not look at it through a dichotomous lens and as a dichotomous question, but try to understand it as an election in and of itself, where there are so many different agents competing for resources. That's one part of the question. And the other part of the question is about this democratic revival at the municipal level or through the power of municipalities against the autocrats. Are we really seeing an autocratic push against the autocratism, or are we just seeing the procedural elections or procedural democracy working itself out again, but this time being used as pro-democracy forces? Are we seeing really a transition or a transformation? Take it from the gender perspective. Look at all these guys in there, and I use the term guys purposefully. Do we see any women in the three big cities who are nominated by the three big parties? Were there any women nominees and the women elected municipal leaders, either in the councils, municipal councils, or as mayors in big cities or small cities? Is there any transition in there that's happening? So are we being very hopeful about autocracy declining, or are we seeing a populist democracy increasing now with the power of those pro-democratic forces? Okay.
Let's get more comments and questions. Larry?
So I have two comments. One is, I do think the lens of competitive authoritarianism is very helpful and instructive here in multiple ways. It can be useful for competitive authoritarian regimes to allow the opposition to win some subnational races, to validate their claim that they're democratic. It's kind of a fine balance, because if you get some opposition victories, it validates the claim. If they win the financial capital and the most important city, then you've kind of overcorrected for the problem. These kinds, there's a big history showing in Mexico and Malaysia and a lot of places that subnational election victories can be a stepping stone to national power rotation. But the thing is that it's still it's a competitive authoritarian regime, but it's still an authoritarian regime. So what would stop Erdogan from doing 4 years from now what he did last time and disqualifying the most popular candidate? And how would the opposition prepare for that? That leads to my second point, which is really a comment that anyone who doesn't take seriously the variable of leadership and the capacity and personality of the candidate in elections, including elections to determine whether democracy will be restored, just doesn't know anything about politics. And this is the problem, if I may say so, with a lot of political scientists who, because they can't measure quantitatively leadership, essentially ignore it as a variable. There's a new book coming out from my colleague Steve Fish at Berkeley that makes this point very powerfully. It'll be out next month. I'd recommend it to people, about the importance of leadership strength, and that it resonates with the point that was made at the beginning here about how weak the CHP presidential candidate was, and how I think plausible it is to imagine that with a stronger candidate, the opposition would have won the last presidential election. So anyway, I'd welcome your reactions to those comments.
Nessie?
Yeah, kind of following up on one of those points. I'm wondering how you thought about the Bonn uprising that happened, like in response to the election.
Could you tell what one uprising for those?
As you see in this map, the pro-Kurdish party won the municipality in Van. They had already won it in 2019, but it was taken from them by government appointment, like under false pretenses. And they tried to do it again by giving the official certificate of election to the runner-up, who won 27% of the vote versus the 60% of the winner. So then there was a massive uprising in the streets that lasted 2 days, that was supported by other opposition parties, at least rhetorically, and it did end up in a government step back. The government actually changed its mind and gave the election certification to the winner.
Yeah.
So what do you think that tells? Is there more of a willingness to go out on the street from Kurds? Is the Kurdish movement re-engaging the street? Is the street regaining legitimacy in Turkish politics that it's lost? And why would Erdogan have taken the step back? What does that say for other cities? Like, are they going to attempt this again in Diyarbakir and see what happens?
Let's discuss these questions, and then let's do another tour.
Yeah, I would like to start with what Dr. Diamond just said about the subnational election victories being a stepping stone to national, and it's Erdogan's own path, right? He was a very successful mayor of Istanbul before he stepped into this national post. And your question about what would happen if Erdogan overturns the elections next time around, and it's a legitimate question, but it's a mixed bag because he tried it before. In 2015 June elections, his party lost the parliamentary majority for the first time, and he basically did not accept the result. And in turn, he called for another elections, and he won. And in the meantime, in the few months that was between, he unleashed chaos on the streets of Turkey. The peace process with the Kurds broke down. ISIS all of a sudden started exploding bombs in big cities. And he famously said to the voters, your choice is between me and chaos. And people picked him. So it worked in 2015. He tried again, this time in 2019 in Istanbul. He lost Istanbul, and he called for a rerun, and he lost miserably. And as Nasi just said, in Van, he tried again. But what happened then? People took to the streets and he backed down. So I guess my answer to your question is it depends on who the leadership, who is leading the answer to Erdogan's move. In 2015, one of the reasons why opposition just backed down and bowed to Erdogan's move to call for a rerun, because we had Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu at the helm, who is a very cautious figure. He didn't, and after that I talked to him and I said, you know, it was constitutionally your party's right to form the government. Why didn't you do that? Because Erdogan blocked it, he said. Well, if Erdogan blocked it, you had constitutional ways to counter that. You could call the people to the streets. You did none of that. And I think it's about his cautious nature. So eventually, Erdogan recaptured the majority. In 2019, İmamoğlu, Istanbul mayor, did not back down. He spent time on the streets, mobilizing the people, and he increased his votes. In Van as well. This time around, opposition leaders, not just the pro-Kurdish party, but also the CHP people, they came together. They supported the protesters, and Erdogan was forced to back down. So if next time around, let's say in 2028, he loses the elections, what's going to happen? I guess it will all depend on what the opposition will do about it. But I'm hopeful that it's going to be different this time, because at the helm are people like İmamoğlu, and Özgür Özel is a very fiery figure too. He's not someone who will just shut up and take the fall. So that's why I think it's important to focus on what the new leadership is going to do. And your question about the Kurds, I think, yeah, it's something that we haven't discussed. And one of the key takeaways from local elections is that it's very interesting. The CHP has become at the same time the most Turkish nationalist and Kurdish nationalist party in many ways, right? Because the pro-Kurdish party, so the Kurdish electorate, Kurdish nationalists said this. Maybe I shouldn't just say Kurdish nationalists, but Kurds in general. So 10 years ago, we used to have this consensus, which is 50% of Kurds, both conservative and nationalist Kurds, they vote for the nationalist, Kurdish nationalist party, and 50% vote for conservative party, right? So that assumption guided our thinking about the Kurds for many decades. Last 3 weeks ago, we realized that that's not the case anymore. Erdogan has consistently lost ground among Kurdish supporters, both conservative Kurds and Kurdish nationalists. So in the Kurdish region, the pro-Kurdish party captured more municipalities than it did in 2019. But I have to add this, there was a significant drop in voter turnout, 10% drop. And Kurds are usually the most politically active segment of the country. So that means that Kurds are fed up. And the second thing that it says is Kurds, both conservative and nationalists, are saying to Erdogan, enough of your repression. We're not going to be supporting your repression using the state security forces, depriving of our right to vote. we're not going to back that anymore. That was the most unmistaken signal that the Kurds were giving. They said instead, those of us who cannot vote for the pro-Kurdish party, we're going to vote for the Islamist party, but not for you. So that is very significant, right? And the second thing is Kurds in big cities, again, I'm saying this without any data, but in big cities, in my hometown, there's a significant, the Kurdish political movement is very strong.
Mersin.
In Mersin. And many of them, despite their own party fielded its own candidate, they voted for main opposition party. So what does that say? It says a couple things. I think about Kurdish nationalism and nationalism in general, nationalism is salient when, in the Turkish case, the PKK is blowing up the militants on Turkish streets, if there's a significant war in Syria between Turkish forces and the PKK, and if Erdogan and other leaders are constantly politicizing this. None of that was the case. So Kurds are just like any other Turkish voter who is very concerned about local government, economy, and this and that. So, but what this Kurdish vote for the opposition in big cities is also telling me that they feel like the CHP, voting for a CHP is not that far-fetched of an idea for them anymore, which was the case only a few years ago. So this could open a pathway for 2028 for the main opposition party, and that is, for a long time, one of the reasons why the CHP could not mount an effective fight against Erdogan was they couldn't appeal to the Kurds strongly enough. Now they have an option. So if they can build on that, I think 2028 could be a comfortable win for them. I think
Would you like to add comments to these questions?
Yeah. So, I mean, about the Kurds, right? I mean, this one example is very, very significant. I think the opposition had a big win there, getting together and fighting this what we call kayyum system. These are like basically state-appointed trustees. Since 2016, Erdogan systematically dismissing all the mayors in the Kurdish region and then appointing like state officials there. And this does at least two things for Erdogan. One is that he weakens the Kurdish movement and gets hold of those municipalities and their resources, and then use those resources to support his own patronage system. But also by declaring that these mayors are like, you know, supporting terrorism or things like that, he was trying to get at the opposition coalition, which also involved an ultranationalist party. So he was trying to divide. So this kayyum system was working for that. And by sort of standing against this one case, like the appointing of a trustee there, I think opposition kind of break that practice, and that was very, very important. Going back to this methodology question about like thinking about, you know, the opposition versus Erdogan, but the opposition is very colored. Actually, when you look at the ballot box in ballots this last election, there were 24 parties. Like my parents live in Izmir, which is a very secular place, and I was just walking on the streets and I see Hüdapar. Hüdapar is a radical Islamist party which will involve radical Kurdish Islamist party, which was involved in very violent attacks in the 90s. They have a candidate in this like small Izmir town, mostly, you know, inhabited by like, you know, middle class, upper class people. So it's a very, very diverse sort of platform. So so yeah, I mean, I agree, but I think there is a movement against the autocratic regime in Turkey. Maybe because of the economy, maybe because people are fed up with things. There is that. I think there is a pluralist sort of platform that is like developing and
improving its strategies day by day in Turkey. I truly believe. And for gender, I think gender is one important signification, like indicator of that. We have so many new female mayors. It's like incredible. Like in Batman, in the east of Turkey, it's like the most conservative place. We have this young woman who fought against like the Islamist party and won. I mean, there are many examples like that. Maybe the 3 mayors in Istanbul, Ankara are not like women, but they're woman mayors everywhere.
Üsküdar is very interesting.
Üsküdar is like, there's so many interesting cases, and I mean, I personally believe, like, you know, we need to follow these municipalities. We need to pick like certain municipalities and follow them over 5 years, like as social scientists. What is really encouraging, I think, going back to my point about the organization of the party, Republican People's Party, changing, it's like becoming more rational about things now. They come up with some ideas like, oh, let's form this committee, like to guide these municipalities, make sure that they speak to each other, and we kind of audit what they are doing, you know, from the party, so that things go right. And I think also, from the social scientific perspective, it would be nice to sort of follow these municipalities and see how they do things on the ground. Yeah.
Let me also say one thing about 2 things. One about the Kurds, one about this party. In a way, the Burçak's comment about the Kurdish thing. It seems that there are 2 major trends in Kurdish movement. If we, I'm not talking about the Islamist Kurdish, but the main Kurdish political movement. There's a major trend, after disappointment in the last election, what a friend of mine called it a kind of Kurdistani movement, a kind of, okay, forget about Turkish politics, let's focus on Kurdistan as a unit and create another strategy, the long-term strategy. Versus, no, we live in Turkish cities, and we have to consider Turkey as a unit or something. So there was a kind of interesting tension between the Kurdish voters in Western cities, or like Mersin, and in Turkish Kurdistan. I think this is very interesting tension, and there's a dialogue, there's actual discussion in Kurdish movement about this today. In certain Kurdish political leaders, in a way, they try to instrumentalize Kurdish voters in the Western cities, saying that, okay, we will choose the opposition, or we will decide. But it didn't work. So the Kurdish political movement it actually is losing Kurdish voters in the Western cities, or there's a risk that they can lose. It's very, very interesting. Second, about to Burçak's point about this populism. I agree. I mean, I think there's also your comment about the Republican Party is having this commission to audit the mayors. But there's this interesting tension there as well. I mean, whether it's going to be party who's going to decide the norms, or leave these municipal leaders in a way free so that they can create their own alliances. But this is very interesting tension, because at the end of the Republican Party, it's a party, and you cannot. And then municipal leaders have their own dynamics, and they need to create their own alliances. So, to what extent a kind of an old party discipline forms would shape politics today, or is it more a kind of a municipal leaders with their populist agendas, in a way, would run the show? So this will be a very interesting to watch. I mean, I think political parties are really losing their ground everywhere, but also in Turkey overall. So we have, for that reason, we have a kind of new leadership. Now the Republican Party leader, it's like almost like German model, the German Social Democratic model. There's a Republican Party leader, but there's a real leader in a way. The popular leader is a mayor. So very, very interesting. Whether this relationship between the party leader and the popular leader would create a kind of a tension, or this would be the way to go. We'll see.
two short remarks and to give some more time to the audience. One is just about the Kurdish one case, one incident. I think Erdogan doesn't feel like he has the mandate anymore to repress. So he felt like he was able to, he had the mandate to repress the Kurdish movement in the previous elections, but this time
It didn't work.
he has, you know, like he shows that he feels he doesn't have that mandate. And second, I forgot about the second point. Yeah, paper.
I have two questions, one for Gönül and the second one is for all panelists. Gönül, you mentioned about the delayed water reaction, and can we say also this is a kind of indirect water reaction, which means that, you know, considering the dynamics between İnönü and Atatürk, you know, who can criticize more, and, you know, voters are basically playing a safe bet, you know, without criticizing Erdogan himself by giving the message, which means that if we have a national election today, Erdogan can still win. And the second question is about, you know, the mayors. And since one of the success of Erdogan is Turkey has become a party state, parti devleti, in the last 20 years, when mayors revolt, is it, you know, mayors versus AKP, mayors versus Erdogan, or is it mayors versus state at one point?
Or regime.
Yeah.
You're going to? Yeah.
First of all, I had a question regarding the Kurdish population and the Kurdish party, and you answered that. Thank you. I would like to find out what you think about Erdogan working to regain power or regain majority, possibly using his old methods of fear and chaos, using the wars in the region, as well as possibly the U.S. elections.
Trump possibly.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm absolutely fascinated by some of the data that Gönül, I think you shared about Erdogan's losing some of his base. I wanted to bring in the factor of religion as well, where we know for the past few years he's been tailoring more towards the very conservative factions in order to elevate, so at the cost of women's rights in particular. Withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention was one of those instances. It seems like in this local elections, some of that vote went to the ultra conservatives. I'm trying to think about if we want to translate this local election for any successes for the opposition for the national. I'm assuming they will again build a coalition with one another. Therefore, this would translate into sort of weak. So I just wanted to maybe have you comment a little bit about the role of religion. I mean, considering we know that his electorate is not a monolith, but I think that's definitely something that is quite complex.
So I'll cut the preamble. Great, fascinating discussion. If at the next general election you were advising one of the leaders running against Erdogan, given nobody else has the stage like he does and the control that Erdogan does, what would you advise this person to do more and less of? We know Ekrem İmamoğlu may be one of that, but there may be others as well.
Okay, well, is this an indirect, you talked about, is this an indirect voter reaction? It certainly is, because it's not completely abandoning. So the majority, overwhelming majority of those who did not get out to vote, they are AKP supporters.
We don't know, by the way. There's a recent poll showing that, in fact, Republican supporters didn't go to vote more than AKP supporters.
Erdogan himself said that majority.
No, there's a new study on that.
Okay, I didn't see that, but Erdogan himself said that those who didn't vote, they're mostly our supporters.
That's what Erdogan said.
Yeah, so I think that is a safer way for disgruntled AKP voters to say that we're not really happy with the direction you're taking the country to. So this is not just a red light, but asking Erdogan to correct course. So he still have four years to do that. And in terms of your question about is this going to be mayors versus state, it's been like that for a long time now. But the question is, can they actually take on the state? And İmamoğlu showed that they can. Because in a centralized state like Turkey and Israel, I'm going to refer to this upcoming piece that we wrote, Israel is a very centralized state too. And in such states where central government controls all the resources, there are so much that the mayors can do, right? Because they are dependent on the resources coming from the central government. But mayors, in Istanbul case and in Tel Aviv too, they manage to find alternative outside resources to complement that. And I think that's a great achievement. And now municipalities like Istanbul is in a better spot because now they have the backing of the city commission, right? They have the majority there. So that things are going to be easier. But I have to caution there too, because recently Mehmet Şimşek said that there are going to be less resources for the mayors. Now the CHP captured all municipalities. But I don't see that as a big block that would really stop these mayors to do their work. The question about religion is really interesting. I mean, religion, I think Erdogan gave Islam a bad name. So he has damaged Islam more than secularists could have even dreamt of, right? That's such a, to me, striking thing that we've seen in the 20 years that he's been in power. But on the other hand, it's not that surprising. Look at Iran, right? But yes, he has damaged Islam, and that's why I think there's been a growing Islamist opposition to Erdogan. And we saw that in Gezi protests, where I attended Gezi protests, and I remember seeing all these Islamist groups on the street protesting Erdogan, saying that with you, Islam became synonymous with corruption and state power. So that was a big no-no. And I think that is very significant. Whether religion played a role, I can't tell, but I can only guess the significant gains that the real Islamist party here, Yeniden Refah, made in some places indicates that there is this Islamist resentment towards Erdogan. And in general too, I mean, in the young generation, the young people are really fed up with Erdogan's the Sunni Islam vision, and that could really play a role in the years to come. And can Erdogan turn things around using foreign policy? Well, we've seen time again that he's a political survivor, and he can. But I think we are past times when Erdogan could launch another military incursion into Syria and turn things around, right? That was in 2016. It worked brilliantly. I think that's run its course now, because the country is struggling with real problems. And the IMF, I just saw the IMF forecast for the country. It's not looking good. So things are going to get worse before they get better, which means that Erdogan has to really deliver on the things that are important to the voters. So launching another military incursion into Syria is not going to cut it.
One thing about the Islamist party, this new Islamist party, I did some research on that. So it's a fascinating story. They started their campaign a couple of years ago with the anti-vaccine movement and very firmly anti-LGBTQ. But the class base of the party is a labor, lower income, and peasant. So it
Hence
really,
the Rafah.
huh?
Hence the Rafah part. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, this is really a kind of Islamist labor party, I call it actually. Populist Islamist labor party or something. So very interesting to follow. It's not an old Islamist, I don't know, but we discussed with I mean, he's a real expert on Islamic political movement, but I find it like fascinating, and I don't think it is an old Islamist party kind of style. I think they have something new in their baggage, and we'll see how it goes. And one thing about, another thing that we didn't discuss, I mean, the Erdogan regime, Erdogan is there, but there are all kind of other partners of this regime, formal, informal. some business partners, some military partners, some Turkish intelligence, is involved. So the regime composition is not just a party and Erdogan. It's much more complex than that. It's a state, but more than the state also. Putin is a partner. So the partnership, if you think regime is a partner, larger part, like not even national, but international partnership, then we have to really think, uncover this. What kind of partnership is that? So for me, like the regime is more important than the government, and Erdogan is an orchestrator of the regime, and how the regime would react to this new reality is another question, different question than how, say, Justice of Development Party would react. Justice of Development Party is only one element of the regime.
Very true. Very true. I think there was one question.
One
about,
question?
Advising.
Advising.
A couple of things about religion.
Yeah. So please.
Actually, there's a lot to be said about Erdogan's effect on religiosity in Turkey, and the way Gönül put it. So back in Gezi, like there were a lot of anti-Erdogan youth movements, which were able to like get some attention, but they did not have this much big base. So what happened is over time, like as I observed them, most of them actually, like even the one like who designed the logo of anti-capitalist Muslims, they left religion basically. They are now atheists, like a lot of them are now atheists. But on the other hand, like so they could not create a base, and like also Felicity party of Erbakan's party basically, it could never gain track in the population. For some reason, this time around, like Erbakan's son was able to gain that ground and capture those votes from within AKP's base. So there's a lot to unpack and analyze there.
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
It all just makes sense, I think, to me that Yeniden Refah Partisi, new Refah Party, welfare party, is getting these votes. When you look at the moment that Refah Partisi became really like strong or got significant sort of increase in its vote share in 1991, is like another kind of like economic crisis moment. No, I mean it's like. And I mean, it kind of speaks to what you were saying about this, like Islamist party being a labor party, and it's really related to the economy and among other things. Yeah. I mean,
yeah. What would you advise to?
Well, you're the one who should be answering this question. But let me say a few things. Well, so my first advice would be start from today. And relate to people, convey to people that you actually can govern. İmamoğlu and others, they built a great track record as mayors. Just keep on what you've been doing. And one top thing that I would consider is tackle corruption. Because corruption goes to the heart of this resentment, right? So just build on that. I think, and I was talking to Mersin Mayor, who is also he's done a marvelous job. I mean, if I was being completely objective, if I looked at his track record, he's done such great work on the ground. I mean, he created these laundries across the city for students. He built these cheap restaurants for people just to grab food. So he's become very popular. So he was actually delivering. And at the micro level, he was tackling poverty and corruption. So make a list of, display these documents. It's basically displaying how corrupt the AKP municipalities were. So make sure that people understand that, and do the work that you need to do as mayors, but also go beyond that. Go beyond collecting trash, the mundane tasks of mayors, right? You can't just be collecting trash and this and that, but also, and this is, I think, İmamoğlu is excellent at that, but also project power and weighing on the national and even international questions, because we're living in a world where you don't, as a mayor, you don't have the luxury of staying away from big, hot foreign policy topics. You have to weigh in on everything, right? So I think that would be the advice, but first they have to start with corruption and exposing corruption.
On that note, thank you very much. It was wonderful. Thank you for participation.